give us that hope that comes through the light of the second bishop, St. Augustine, John 4.
You were very kind. Thank you.
He was afraid because he taught me and I could tell you a lot more. But
Please sit down, Bishop. Thank you, Bishop Noonan. That was very kind words. And he was a student of mine way back in St. John Vianney days. And there are tales to be told and all of that, but we won't go there. But thank you for your kind introduction, your kind words. Everybody can hear me okay? Brennan, you got me connected? Okay. I'm honored and privileged to be part of the 150th anniversary of the Diocese of St. Augustine. It's a significant event, not only for the people here, but for all Floridians, most especially Catholics who live in the state's 7 dioceses. Firstly, I want to thank those who traveled from afar to be here this evening, especially those from Fort Pierce and Orlando and Savannah and Atlanta and Colton Point, Maryland, and all the way from Jacksonville. Most especially, I want to thank Bishop Felipe J. Esteves, who, with the late Father John Phillips, conceived this event. Moreover, without the bishop's encouragement and support for my book on Moore, it may have never seen the light of day. Bishop Esteves, you are hearkening back to the days of Archbishop Hurley, who was a patron of the arts, of scholarship, and of history. This diocesan anniversary is a fitting crescendo to your faith-filled Episcopal service to the people of St. Augustine and beyond. Well done, good and faithful servant. Gallia est omnis divisa in partes tres. So begins Julius Caesar's The Gallic War. Caesar's well-known book serves as a fitting entree to this talk about the birth of the Diocese of St. Augustine and of our first 2 bishops. Like Caesar's Gaul, this presentation is divided into 3 parts. Part 1, the beginnings of the diocese and Bishop Verot. Part 2, the second Bishop of St. Augustine, John Moore. And Part 3, Verot and Moore compared. Caesar's work is set in Gaul. One of our first 2 bishops was a Frenchman, and the other studied in France as a seminarian. Caesar read, wrote, and spoke Latin, as did both of our first bishops. For them, Latin was not only the official language of the Church, but also the language of liturgical prayer and sacramental life. Finally, Caesar wrote about warfare. Both of our bishops experienced the effects of real warfare firsthand during the American Civil War. They also conducted what might be called a spiritual campaign during Reconstruction and afterwards in struggling to provide for the pastoral needs of their people despite a paucity of resources. So now, part 1, the beginnings of the diocese and Bishop Verot. When the Diocese of St. Augustine was erected on March 11, 1870, Catholicism already existed in Florida for 3 centuries. Yet throughout that time, Florida remained a frontier in terms of its population density, its economy, its politics, and its ecclesiastical life, largely due to the social, political, and economic dislocations and discontinuities it inherited from its fractured past. When Florida was founded in 1565 as a Spanish colony, it was at the periphery of the Spanish Empire and at the periphery of the Spanish possessions in the New World. It served as a borderland, a military tripwire for incursions by other colonial powers, a backwater. One of Spanish Florida's greatest achievements, the extensive Franciscan missions to the indigenous peoples, were at times threatened by disputes between the friars and colonial officials, and were eventually destroyed by the English from South Carolina and their Creek allies from 1702 to 1708 during Queen Anne's. As a result of the French and Indian War, Spain lost Florida to Britain in 1763. The few remaining Catholic Indians, all the church records, and virtually all the Catholics, about 3,000 or so, emigrated to Havana. Since public Catholic worship was illegal throughout most of the British Empire, when Catholic Minorcans processed from the Trumbull Plantation in New Smyrna to St. Augustine in March of 1577, followed in November by their priest, Father Pedro Camps, the practice of their religion was allowed, but kept quietly out of the public eye. But it was the Minorcans and a few Irish Catholic soldiers stationed in St. Augustine that kept Catholicism alive during the British period. The English commandeered the bishop's house and the Franciscan convent, the former becoming an Anglican church and the latter a military barracks. Florida reverted back to Spain as a colony in 1783 as a result of the American Revolutionary War. Although the Spanish Empire was weaker than ever, it did manage to fund and build a new Coquina church in St. Augustine under the direct supervision of the colonial governor. Begun in 1793, the church was completed in 1797. The parish's pastor was Father Miguel O'Reilly, an Irishman. With the peace treaty settling the War of 1812 signed in 1819 between the United States and Britain, Florida became a U.S. territory in 1821. Only after the Second Seminole War did Florida become a state, along with Texas, in 1845. Catholics in East Florida, who remained during the American period, were rapidly being outnumbered by Protestant Americans, streaming into the state, seeking land and economic opportunities. As can be seen, Florida's history is marked more by discontinuity than continuity, by disjunction rather than conjunction, characteristics that remain with us into the 21st century, as wave after wave of newcomers and winter visitors continue to break upon our shores, often nearly erasing the footprints left from the past. Florida is constantly reinventing itself. From colonial times to the mid-1850s, Florida Catholicism was always on the periphery ecclesiastically, being passed from one jurisdiction to another. Santiago de Cuba, Havana, Louisiana and the Floridas, former British East and West Florida, the Vicariate of Alabama and the Floridas, the Diocese of Mobile, which retained the Panhandle under its jurisdiction until as late as 1975, and finally Savannah from 1850. Then in January of 1857, East Florida was declared an apostolic vicariate. By January of 1858, Augustine Verot was appointed the head of the new vicariate. Ordained a bishop in Baltimore on April 25th of 1858, Verot arrived in St. Augustine on June 1st of that same year. Although Catholicity had existed in Florida for almost 300 years, it did not have much to show for itself. Verot discovered the vicariate contained 3 parishes. St. Augustine and Jacksonville had residential pastors, but Key West did not. It also contained 7 mission chapels, 3 priests, an Irishman in Jacksonville, and 2 French Fathers of Mercy in St. Augustine. The entire vicariate contained only a couple of thousand Catholics. There were no Catholic schools, no women religious, and a paucity of financial resources Immediately, Verot set out to improve the situation. As he wrote in his first pastoral letter, dated August 28th of 1858, "We entertain bright hopes for the spiritual generation of Florida. But in the meantime, the spectacle of its spiritual desolation saddens us to tears. We hope with time we will be able to remedy this evil." Augustine Verot was born on May 23rd of 1805 in Le Puy, France, the son of a dealer in lace. In October of 1821, he entered the seminary at Issy near Paris, which was run by the Sulpician Fathers. He was ordained in Paris on September 20th of 1828. By 1830, he joined the Society of Saint Sulpice, a religious community of diocesan priests dedicated to the education of aspirants to the priesthood. That same year, because of the French Revolution of July of 1830, his superiors sent Verot to the United States, where he was assigned to St. Mary's College, Baltimore, Maryland, to teach mathematics and natural sciences. With the closure of that college in 1852, Verot was at a crossroads. He was supposed to be in the United States for only 7 years, but by 1852 he lived in the country for 22 years. He wanted to return to France. Although he enjoyed teaching and the students, he did not care for imposing the strict discipline of the times upon them. He also was unhappy at St. Mary's due to the personal failings of his Sulpician superiors there. But instead of returning to France, as he wished, Verot was assigned to teach mathematics and the sciences at St. Charles College and was made a part-time pastor at St. Paul's Church, Ellicott's Mills, Maryland. After a year, he was named as the full-time pastor of St. Paul's, where he also engaged in ministering to both free and slave blacks. Verot was now much happier in his role as pastor. A good preacher, logical, forceful, always appealing to the intellect, he was also a man of genial wit, although notably indifferent toward his personal appearance. He was, shall we say, unkempt. When named to the Vicariate of Florida, he attempted to thwart the appointment, citing poor health, his age, he was 52 at the time, his discomfort in hot and tropical weather, plus stating that he, quote, always wanted to live and die a Sulpician. Earlier, in October of 1852, Verot described his physical state in a letter to a friend. "I would not want to leave you with the impression that the idea I have begun to grow old is an exaggeration. I no longer hear well in 1 year. The tympanum of the other is broken. I have no teeth for chewing save one, which is loose. I have been equipped with dentures. Furthermore, I must tell you that I am often aware of not being able to remember certain things." I'm sure nobody ever here has had a senior moment. He goes on, "The life and difficulty of a very painful and laborious mission during the 22 years in Maryland has just about worn me out." Nonetheless, both his Sulpician superior in France and the Archbishop of Baltimore, Francis P. Kendrick, persuaded him to accept the appointment to Florida out of obedience. And so he did, despite all of his personal reservations. The state's population in 1860 was just over 140,000, comprised of just over 77,000 whites, over 61,000 slaves, and 932 free blacks. A total of 44.6% of the total population was black. In 1860, the highest consecration of Catholics was in St. Augustine, with 952 whites, 376 blacks, who represented 28.3% of the total Catholic population of 1328. By 1870, the state's population rose slightly to just over 187,000, but Florida's Catholics only constituted about 3 or 4% of the total population. Verot desperately needed ecclesiastical personnel, so in 1859 he traveled to France, recruiting 7 priests from there. That same year, he asked 5 Sisters of Mercy from Hartford, Connecticut, to open a girls' academy in St. Augustine. Later, in 1866, he journeyed to Montreal and invited Father Jean-Baptiste Dillard, OMI, to be the pastor of St. Mary's Star of the Sea in Key West. 2 years later, Allard welcomed to Key West the Sisters of the Holy Names from Montreal with Verot's encouragement. Meanwhile, also in 1866, Verot traveled to Rhode Island and Connecticut, raising money and searching for personnel. Likewise, in 1866, Verot sailed to France, where he recruited from his hometown of Le Puy 8 Sisters of St. Joseph for the express purpose of establishing Catholic schools for blacks, the most ambitious Catholic project in the South for the newly freed African Americans. He fueled this Catholic Reconstruction project by begging money from the Society of the Propagation of the Faith, located in Paris and Lyon, and from Paris in the northern U.S. In the midst of the Civil War, Verot was appointed the 3rd Bishop of Savannah in 1862, while retaining the Vicariate of Florida. At the time, the Diocese of Savannah had 10 churches and chapels, 7 schools, and about 8,000 Catholics. By 1870, that diocese possessed 9 churches, 30 chapels and stations, 11 schools, and a Catholic population of about 20,000. Verot could have stayed in Savannah when St. Augustine was created a diocese in 1870, but instead he specifically requested St. Augustine, the lesser of the two, as he wrote. I have chosen St. Augustine in preference to Savannah principally because St. Augustine and Florida are the places where I first was sent. And also because in Florida there is more holy poverty, as well as more good to be done in building churches and founding schools. The new diocese comprised all the territory east of the Apalachicola River, the dividing line between British colonial East and West Florida. That is almost 47,000 square miles, or 80.2% of the state's total square miles. Now, able to devote his considerable energies to one region, he set about to build upon what he had started previously in Florida. Between 1870 and 72, Verot made repairs to the old church of St. Augustine, raising funds from a fair held in the city and from a begging tour of parishes in Baltimore, Brooklyn, and Augusta. In 1874, he funded and completed the construction of the Mother House, an academy for the Sisters of St. Joseph and St. Augustine, over the objections of some of the clergy. He oversaw the erection of St. Peter's Church, Tallahassee, in 1859, St. Louis Parish in Tampa, 1860, St. Leopold's, Mill Creek, 1873, Immaculate Conception Church, Jacksonville, 1874, St. Michael's, Fernandina, 1874, and St. Ambrose, Elkton, in 1875. But Verot was not just a builder of buildings, a raiser of money, a recruiter of personnel. He was a pastor of souls. He creatively envisioned a spiritual reconstruction of all the people under his care. He funded the Redemptorists in making a series of parish missions in Georgia and Florida in 1868, 1869, and 1870. He also established America's first black Catholic schools in Georgia and Florida. Verot was constantly on the move. as the Vicar Apostolic of Florida for 12 years, the Bishop of Savannah for just over 7 years, and the Bishop of St. Augustine for just over 5 years. He annually visited the Catholic outposts scattered throughout his jurisdiction, despite bad roads, poor transportation, and numerous personal discomforts. As Father Henry Claverol commented, Verot disregarded, quote, even the ordinary comforts of life, end quote. And the vigorous missionary bishop endured, quote, sleepless nights, protracted fasts, exposure, and long, interminable rides through roads often impassable. Not one day, not 1 hour was not full in which did not see him at work, end quote. Besides making pastoral visits to his people, he also traveled frequently up north to beg in parishes for funds for his poor diocese and to search out personnel. Verot lived a life of prayer and action. Through his tireless leadership, he formed something out of practically nothing, meeting the challenges of both material and personal poverty. Throughout his episcopacy, he was a man to whom truth mattered greatly, for whom personal comfort counted for little, and to whom concern for those in need meant everything. Verot died on June 10th of 1876 at the Cathedral Rectory at the age of 71. For a man who at the age of 52 felt he was too old and spent to be bishop in 1858, he exercised in Florida and Georgia an episcopacy characterized by great pastoral energy and ingenuity. Part 2, the second bishop of St. Augustine, John Moore. John Moore was the second youngest of 5 children, born on June 27, 1835 in County Westmeath, Ireland. His father died during the potato famine, which necessitated the family's emigration from Ireland. They sailed to Charleston, South Carolina, arriving in late 1848. The following year, John entered the local seminary in Charleston, where he was transferred to Columbray Seminary College in France. In 1855, he was assigned to study in Rome at the Urban College, where he was ordained in 1860 and earned a doctorate in theology. Returning to Charleston in October of 1860, he was stationed at the cathedral, serving the people there and those in its surrounding missions. In mid-1862, he was named the administrator of St. Joseph's Parish, Charleston, while in February of 1865, he was named the pastor of St. Patrick's Parish, Charleston. For a time, in the summer of 1865, he was the only functioning priest in the city of Charleston. After the war, during Reconstruction, his parish, St. Patrick's, was the most populous, most vibrant one in the city. It had a congregation of both blacks and whites, as well as Charleston's largest Catholic Sunday school. While attempting to establish the diocese's first parochial school, his plan was thwarted by his bishop, Patrick Lynch, who, nevertheless, in 1872 named him the Vicar General of the diocese, tasked with overseeing the clergy and the diocesan congregation of Mercy Sisters. On May 13, 1877, he was ordained a bishop in Charleston and was installed as the second bishop of St. Augustine 6 days later. At that time, the Diocese of St. Augustine contained 11 priests, none of whom were American-born. 2 French Canadians, 3 Italians, and 6 Frenchmen. There were 8 parishes, 11 missions, and about 70 stations, 6 Catholic academies, 6 black Catholic schools with just over 300 pupils total, and 2 women religious communities, the Sisters of the Holy Names and the Sisters of St. Joseph. The diocese was mostly rural, a frontier, with only 2 cities of note, Jacksonville and Key West, the latter being the largest of the 2. Although a guesstimate, there were around maybe 10,000 Catholics in the diocese. By his death in 1901, 20% of the state's population lived in urban areas as opposed to 10% at 1870. Tampa became the second largest city in the territory, with Jacksonville the first. New towns and small cities were springing up mostly in the South Florida, with the coming of the railroads along the east and west coast, the construction of luxury hotels which served high-end tourism, the opening of small hotels and boarding houses to accommodate visiting hunters and sports fishermen and fisherwomen. During the late 19th century, Florida encountered its first large-scale developers, people such as Plant, Flagler, Diston, and Ebor. In addition, agriculture prospered, especially the citrus industry, with rail transport able to take product to northern markets. From the creation of the diocese in 1870 to 1900, Florida's population grew by 181%, most of which the borders of the diocese. All of this development was part of Florida's first boom, necessitating the expansion of the presence of the church, one which Moore oversaw. By his death on July 30th, 1901, 32 priests served the diocese, mostly Irish diocesan priests and Jesuits and Benedictines. During his episcopacy, he established 9 new parishes, 17 mission churches, 9 new schools for blacks and whites. 2,245 pupils were under instruction in the various Catholic schools, that is, parochial schools, academies, schools for blacks. Staffed by 3 communities of women religious, the Sisters of St. Joseph, the Sisters of the Holy Names, and the Benedictine nuns. In Tampa alone, the numbers of children under instruction in the Catholic schools increased 8.6 times from 1889 to 1901. Part 3, Verot and Moore compared. At first glance, Verot and Moore were quite different kinds of personalities with quite different backgrounds. Verot was a Frenchman. Moore was an Irishman. They brought with them different experiences from their respective nations' history and culture. Verot liked entertaining big ideas, whereas Moore was much more of a practical man of detail, especially regarding administration and finances. Perhaps the greatest difference between them was their attitudes toward public discourse. Verot was outspoken, blunt, straightforward, even feisty. A Union general who dealt with him during the war rebuked him for his, quote, disrespectful and unbecoming language, end quote, and described him as, quote, captious rather than charitable, end quote, and purposely vexatious. Union officers commented that he had, quote, an audacity that sometimes went beyond the bounds, end quote. No wonder Michael Gannon titled his biography of Verot, Rebel Bishop. On the other hand, Moore was quiet, a private man, hard to read, keeping his cards close to his vest. He was reserved, considered in his responses to people and events. His priests nicknamed him Silent John. Verot seemed to relish being in the center of controversy. As a public person, he engaged in a number of leading issues facing the church in America of his day. He also freely engaged in ecclesiastical controversy. When Verot was both the Vicar Apostolic of Florida and the Bishop of Savannah from 1862 to 1870, there was an understandable commingling of finances, property titles, and personnel. With the creation of the Diocese of St. Augustine, Verot proposed an agreement with the new Bishop of Savannah, Ignatius Persico, over these matters. However, Verot drove a hard bargain, and his proposal was contested both by Persico and his successor, William Gross. However, these matters seem to have been resolved well before Verot's death in 1876. During Vatican Council I, that is from 1869 to 1870, Verot openly expressed his opposition to the notion of papal infallibility. Technically, he was an opportunist, one of a number of bishops who thought that the promotion of papal infallibility would be counterproductive for the church at the time. Verot felt that declaring papal infallibility was inadvisable since it was not unanimously held by the bishops at the council, and its pronouncement would alienate American non-Catholics. Verot spoke at the council with directness, practicality, even humor, in a style not appreciated by many of the more formal, sophisticated council fathers. So much so that they derided him as a buffoon and gave him the moniker the enfant terrible of the council. On the other hand, More assiduously shied away from public controversy. Only once did he enter into public dispute when he was the Vicar General of Charleston during a period when his bishop was out of town. Out of a sense of duty and responsibility, he exchanged a series of newspaper articles, under an assumed name, with a member of the city council over the question of public aid to the Catholic orphanages of Charleston. His other foray into public ecclesiastical controversy was his behind-the-scenes defense and support of his Roman classmate and friend, Edward McGlynn of the Archdiocese of New York. Verot wrote articles both in science and religious controversy. He could be combative in print. In 1843, he published a two-part article in the United States Catholic magazine. That same year, he penned 2 religious essays for the Catholic Tract Society on know-nothingism and on comments. The latter article, he opined unfavorably about the Millerites. Just before the outbreak of the war, he published on the controversial topic of slavery, a tract for the Times, Slavery and Abolitionism, a sermon given on January 4th, 1861. He also wrote 11 pastoral letters from 1858 to 1876. Ever the teacher, Verot's publishing venture in early 1876, the St. Augustine Instructor, was an 8-page Catholic newspaper printed on 4 small sheets. Each edition contained a sermon from Verot. The publication died with him. Verot also kept a diary of his Episcopal pastoral visitations. More never published anything. Although a copious writer, he virtually never made copies of any of his letters. The correspondence between himself and his relatives in Charleston are non-extant. He never kept a diary or a journal. Only one interview of him was ever published. Only 3 or 4 photos of him exist. Verot's Florida was a poor frontier, a decidedly missionary enterprise. Although More began his episcopacy under similar circumstances, he was required to respond to a rapidly changing Florida. Yet, despite their differences in temperament, upon closer examination, these 2 men were more alike than different, especially in their pastoral care priorities. 1, both were personally affected by the war and Reconstruction. During the war, Verot negotiated between both armies while traveling between St. Augustine and Savannah. 2 churches were pillaged and ruined in Florida due to the Union occupation, one in Mayport and the other, Immaculate Conception Church and Rectory in Jacksonville. Dire poverty in Florida continued into Reconstruction. His spiritual reconstruction of Catholic life was through parish missions conducted by the Redemptorists and the established Catholic schools. More lived through 587 days of the siege and bombardment of Charleston, ministering to both Union and Confederate soldiers in hospitals. During Reconstruction, he was sometimes limited from those same institutions by Union occupying authorities because he was a Charleston Catholic priest. During and after the war, he feared that his letters were being spied upon by federal authorities. He did not become a U.S. citizen until 1872, when he was appointed Charleston's Vicar General. During Reconstruction, as a pastor and Vicar General, he contributed significantly to the building up of his diocese, impoverished as it was both materially and spiritually. 2, both were constant in pastoral visitation. Pastoral care was a top priority of both men, who displayed their pastoral solicitude by the regular visitation of Florida's parishes and missions. With his diocese very much a frontier, Verot traveled by various conveyances, sometimes personally searching out isolated Catholics living in the hinterlands. Under Moore, Florida was gradually becoming urbanized, with cities and towns being developed rapidly throughout South Florida, the pastoral care for which he had given over to the New Orleans Jesuits. He used mostly the railroads to visit annually the parishes and schools of his diocese. Throughout most of the 1890s, Moore visited the rapidly growing Tampa area 3 times a year. Besides personal visitations, he also kept in communication by correspondence, especially when he was outside the diocese. Both men were constantly in motion, not dictating orders from an office through intermediaries, but in the field, seeing pastoral conditions firsthand and responding to them by personal visitation or correspondence. 3, both men faced financial constraints. Both were strapped financially. Consequently, both traveled up north to beg for money, and both wrote begging letters to missionary organizations. During both men's episcopacies, the diocese and its parishes were, for the most part, not self-supporting. Moore exceeded Verot in borrowing money. He frequently took out loans, especially to fund the reconstruction of his cathedral after it was destroyed by the fire of 1887. Since Florida Catholics did not have the money to rebuild the cathedral, he spent a great deal of time and energy traveling up north, begging year after year in parishes one weekend after another. With considerable efforts and with some financial gymnastics, Moore completed his task of rebuilding the cathedral on Easter of 1901. Just 3 months before his death. 4, both men faced a shortage of clergy. In 1859, Verot journeyed to France to recruit priests for the Florida missions. Later in 1870, he received 2 clergy from the Society of Missionary Priests headquartered in Genoa, Italy. He also recruited some priests from French Canada. It was Moore that invited the New Orleans Jesuits and the Benedictine priests to take over pastoral care of the southern part of the diocese. It was he who focused on recruiting Irishmen for Florida. By 1901, of the total of 32 priests in the diocese, 14 were diocesan, of whom 9, or 64%, were Irishmen. It was he who initiated the practice of regularly recruiting from Ireland seminarians and priests for Florida. But he wanted well-formed priests. Not impressed with most of the American seminaries of the day, he preferred sending his seminarians to Rome for their studies. He, like Verot, could not afford to pay for the education of his future priests, so he depended on obtaining scholarships for them. Based upon his experiences in Charleston, although strapped for priests, he was careful not to sacrifice quality for quantity. As he wrote in 1885, he was often frustrated by the difficulty of trying, quote, to find good priests willing to work for God and not for money, end quote. 5, both were strong supporters of women religious and Catholic education. It was Verot that invited the Sisters of Mercy from Hartford to open an academy for girls in St. Augustine in 1859, where they remained until 1869. He brought over the Sisters of St. Joseph to open Catholic schools for blacks in 1866, and they soon began opening academies for whites beginning in St. Augustine in 1869. In 1868, with the help of the local pastor, Father Jean-Baptiste Soulard, Verot invited the Sisters of the Holy Names of Montreal to Key West, where they eventually opened a girls' academy, a parochial school, a school for Cuban children, and a school for blacks. Moore visited every academy school in the diocese on an annual basis throughout his episcopacy. He approved the expansion of the Sisters of Holy Names to Tampa in 1881, and also brought the Benedictine Sisters from Allegheny, Pennsylvania in 1889 to open Catholic schools in Pasco County. It was he in 1899 who localized the Sisters of St. Joseph as a diocesan congregation rather than one subject to Le Puy, France. 6, both ministered to the marginalized, Seminole Indians, blacks, and Latins. In February of 1872, Verot sent to Miami his Vicar General, Father Peter Dufour, with a letter addressed to the chief of the Seminoles. In it, Verot promised to send a priest and sisters of charity to, quote, teach your children how to read and write and how to please the Great Spirit, end quote. Sadly, the letter was never delivered because Defoe could find no one to take him into the Everglades to meet with the Seminole chief. Moore made a similar gesture in 1886, but had to demur because he had no missionary priest to send. He tried again in 1894. A Tampa Jesuit, Conrad Widman, made contact with the Seminole chief, who was willing to have the Jesuit minister among them. However, the plan was foiled when Widman was transferred from Florida that summer. Moore had no one else to send. Both bishops had an ongoing concern for African Americans. Verot started the Black Catholic schools, staffed by both the Sisters of St. Joseph and the Sisters of the Holy Names. Moore continued to expand that ministry. He also founded 2 parishes for blacks, including St. Benedict the Moor and Parish in St. Augustine and St. Peter Claver School and Parish in Tampa. It was Moore who, during the reconstruction of the cathedral, added the eastern transept for the use of African Americans instead of their climbing up the choir loft, as was the case before the fire. Both bishops also showed solicitude to Hispanics. It was Verot that made sure that the Cubans and Spaniards in Key West had a residential pastor from 1866. Our Lady of Mercy School for Cuban Girls opened there in 1873, although it was closed in 1878 due to low enrollment. Under Moore, Our Lady of Charity of Cobre Chapel was opened in Key West from 1879 to 1898. In Ybor City, the first Catholic church there was opened in 1890, Our Lady of Mercy, named for a Cuban devotion to Mary. It became a parish in 1902. By 1891, the Sisters of St. Joseph opened a school in Ybor City, and the Sisters of the Holy Names opened one in West Tampa in 1896, both serving Cuban and Italian children. 7, both exercised collegiality and responsibilities to the larger church. Both men had a keen sense of the responsibilities to the greater church, where both saw their episcopal obligations and duties extending beyond the boundaries of their diocese. Rowe attended and participated in the Ninth Provincial Council of Baltimore in 1858, the Second Plenary Council of Baltimore in 1866, and the 10th Provincial Council of Baltimore in 1869. It was in this latter council that St. Augustine was proposed as a diocese through Verot's recommendations. Verot also attended and was an outspoken participant in Vatican Council I. Moore was consulted frequently by Archbishop James Gibbons of Baltimore. He also attended Episcopal meetings held in Baltimore, ordinations and funerals of bishops in the region, and the Third Plenary Council of Baltimore in 1884. He was part of a small team of bishops who were successful in having that council's decrees approved by Rome in 1885. Finally, he was a significant participant in a behind-the-scenes defender, mostly with his pen, of Father Edward McGlynn in his battles with his Archbishop Michael J. Corrigan of New York. 8. But the most outstanding qualities that both men shared was their pastoral leadership style and their character. Both men had a strong sense of duty and responsibility. Both were creative, energetic, and resourceful in dealing with difficulties which might appear insurmountable to others. The true test of leadership is not found in drawing up grand schemes and programs, but in responding productively to unexpected obstacles and difficulties. Both Verot and Moore passed that test time and time again. The ultimate model for their pastoral leadership and personal character was Jesus. with whom each had a profound relationship with their lives of prayer and action. It was Jesus who served as a model for them of servant leadership. Although neither man ever wished to draw attention to himself or to his prayerfulness, one can argue that both strove for holiness and a deep friendship with Jesus. A Presbyterian, James Renwick, the architect of St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, and the campanile of the rebuilt cathedral in St. Augustine, wrote to Moore in November of 1888. I thank God that you have recovered from yellow fever and have been enabled to do so much good among your people. How small every other thing seems in this world when it is compared with the self-sacrifice of a pastor who gives up everything for the welfare and well-being of his people. If it were proper to covet anything, I would envy you for the good work you are doing, and I am very thankful that you have been spared to do it. Verot and Moore were both men of high intelligence, keen vision, marked sanctity, and driving zeal. The people of the Diocese of St. Augustine were blessed to have such men leading Florida Catholicism. Both continue to serve us well as models of servant leadership. That is, a willingness to forget one's ego and personal comfort in suffering service to God's people. As Matthew 20 says, whoever wishes to be great among you shall be your servant. Whoever wishes to be first among you shall be your slave. Just so the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Our first two bishops were a blessing for Florida Catholics, then and now. For in them we have outstanding examples of shepherds in the person of Jesus who gave their lives for their sheep without counting the cost. Pardon me?
How did they die?
In bed. Well, I'm not exactly sure of Verot's malady. He went rather quickly. Moore, on the other hand, actually had a serious stroke about a year and a half, 2 years before he actually died. And he was supposedly on the mend and continued to work. But then the last maybe 4 months of his life, that is beginning in 1901, say January 1901, his health really declined. His sister, one of his sisters from Charleston came to be with him. Some of the sisters of St. Joseph were there also with him in his latter weeks, and also Father Mahar, the rector of the cathedral, was there, etc. So his demise was predictable in a sense, although initially he and the doctors felt that he was going to be able to recuperate from this. Yeah. So in a sense it was a heart condition for Moore. Oh, Oh, yeah. I mean, this is another challenge that Moore had to face. It was the growing tentacles of Jim Crow laws, that segregation and the oppression, really, of blacks throughout the South, but in Florida too, got worse from the 1880s on. One example, lynchings increased, by the turn of the century, etc. One of the examples of that would be baseball. In America, in the 1860s, and baseball began to catch on, and there were black players and white players playing on the same teams. But when you get to the late 1870s and into the 1880s, the whole move is to get the black players off and to have black leagues separate. And they had, by the way, some black leagues here in the 1880s and 90s in St. Augustine that played right near the fort. That was the baseball field in those days. So, I mean, this was an ongoing thing that had to be faced. That's why if you look at some of the things, for example, that Moore did, it's quite remarkable that, he did what he could within the constraints and the ever-increasing constraints of society of that time. Yeah. So segregation really got worse in the 1880s, 90s, and into the new century. There's a hand back there. Who is that guy? Who is that man? John, how are you? You're live.
Can't tell it, John. Would you comment on what seems to me interesting, that in the time of the Civil War and shortly before, the churches, Methodist, Episcopal, Presbyterian, split into northern and
Right.
the Catholic Church didn't.
No.
Therefore, during the war's time, the Reconstruction doesn't require the reconstruction of the church, but the Catholic bishops of the South were just as strong in supporting the South
Yeah.
and northern supporting the North. How is it that we didn't split? And any further?
No, that's a good observation, and it's true. Well, I think part of it was that we have a different structure than, we have a sense of unity that's allied with our bishops and the body of the College of Bishops and the Pope. And so that's his real strength when it comes to that kind of stuff. And it's curious, too, that when Moore had to do all his fundraising, especially for the cathedral, where did he go? He went to the north. That's where the money was. That's where the people were. So he went to Philadelphia, New York, Norfolk, Chicago, all those places. So it was almost, and he was a Southerner. I mean, he was from the South. He was a Southern priest. And there didn't seem any problem. He raised money, because they saw, I think the people in the North saw a need. And Moore was very good at presenting what the needs were. But I think a short answer in that, it's probably more complicated than that, but a short answer is just due to the unity of our structure. That we were able to unite the church, even though there were political differences. The Southern bishops and the Southern priests pretty much sided with the Confederacy during the war, as did the Northern priests with the Union. But you got to remember, people fought in those days much more locally than we do. I mean, when he was going to be appointed the head of the Union Army, and he was offered the appointment, he said no, that his loyalty was to his country, Virginia. And that perspective was very much a mid-19th century perspective, that you were an American, yeah, but you were from a state. A state was where you really identified, or the locality you were from. And look what happened during the war. When the people were recruited, they were recruited from a town or from a region, and they fought together. Of course, that created some other problems. If they got wiped out, the whole town got wiped out. That's why afterwards they didn't do that anymore. But what I'm just saying is that I think you can understand the identification of people in the South, with, and especially people in the South in the church, with the rise of the Confederacy and et cetera, versus the Union, because people did think more locally, and I think they saw themselves as probably more members of the state than they would the federal government, especially in the South.
Could you also comment on Andersonville, the response, the church response to the prisoners, the containment during the Civil War? I think it's a high point for church history, but it doesn't get noted very often.
Yeah, well, I think Gannon does a great job in that in his Rebel Bishop book, you know. But honestly, I didn't review that, so I don't have all the details on that, so I couldn't really comment on it. But I know that Gannon spends a good chunk of his time on that question of Andersonville and what was being done, etc.
Other questions?
Whoops, the bishop's got a question.
The bishop, presently,
regarding the book, Victoria Book, I think that that's the contribution that your book has, not only for the church as such, but for society at large, the Floridian society at large. Could you comment a little bit more on that book? Was that, I imagine that it was different in the state of Florida. Could you comment on that?
Well, yes, and I think that's an important point, Bishop, that Moore sort of fell into the fact that he happened to be in charge of the church at a time when the state, especially the southern part of the state, was developing tremendously. And he didn't have the clergy to really make that expansion. That's why he invited the Benedictine fathers for the Pasco County area and the Jesuits, who he invited in 1889 to take over the pastoral care of 1/3 of the state, the southern third of the state, and they were headquartered in Tampa. And my book goes into a lot of detail about that, because they were very well equipped at that particular time to respond to those needs, and they accepted that. In fact, they wanted to do that, and they kind of Stranahan, who was the head of the Jesuit, the superior of the Jesuits at the time, really was angling to get that job, if you will. First of all, the Jesuits had a kind of an excess of personnel due to the revolutions in Europe in 1848. A lot of those men left Europe and came to the United States, and some of them came to New Orleans. So they had a multilingual kind of group that went beyond what any of our diocesan priests could handle. But you needed that when you're dealing with Ybor City, when you're dealing with Key West, and all the different, like the Cubans, the Spanish, the Italians that were in Tampa. You needed to have linguistic abilities, and the Jesuits were well equipped. The other thing the Jesuits had, they had something called an ex-cur. The ex-cur was a Jesuit who was dedicated solely to going out to the hinterlands and gathering Catholics and forming stations, gathering places that the Catholics would meet when a priest would come, or even missions, where they built a little mission church, and when the priest came, they had a little church. And these ex-curs, at one point in Tampa, there were 3 ex-curs whose sole job was to go out. They spent a month, 2 months, 3 months, just trying to locate and gather Catholics that were in various places. And they did a great job. They did great service to the church at that time. The other thing, I think, the first boom is important because most that's been written in Florida history about that boom. There was a biography of Plant. Plant was the man who did the railroads and hotels on the west coast of Florida. That was in 1892. That's the only biography of Plant. There's been a number of biographies of Flagler. And the latest one is by a local professor, Thomas Graham, Flagler's St. Augustine. It's a very nice book. It goes into lots and lots of detail about the hotel life and the glitz of all that. But the period hasn't been looked at all from the point of view of the church or the point of view of another style of leadership that More represents. You know, Flagler was the tycoon and the Gilded Age guy and the multimillionaire. Plant was the same, really. Ebor was a very wealthy cigar manufacturer in Tampa. But, you know, More was a leader too, but a different kind of leader in the same period dealing with similar circumstances. And then, to boot, More had this terrible problem of a cathedral that was destroyed, you know, that had to be rebuilt. And he didn't have anything to rebuild it with. The insurance policy for the cathedral was $10,000, and even back then $10,000 would be more today. But gee, that wasn't enough. I mean, he had I don't know how many hundreds of thousands he had to raise, you know, to rebuild all of this. Well, anyways, I just think it's interesting to look at this period, which you could call the Gilded Age. We could also call it Florida's first boom, because in that period, Florida moves from a kind of a rural-focused state to beginning to be a more urbanized state, with these various settlements developing along the railroad lines, and settlements developing along agricultural, like the citrus industry, etc. So that's what I think is kind of interesting about the book, is it looks at the same period, but basically most of the literature is about the tycoons, about the Flaglers, and about those kind of folks. And here we want to look at the same period, but from another lens, and from another perspective, which has interest to us as Catholics, you know. How did we experience that, you know? And how did our leadership deal with that? So, and by the way, there was a wonderful little article that Lila Ross did in the St. Augustine magazine, the February St. Augustine magazine. She had taken the stuff from my book, but she did a nice little article comparing, or the relationship between Flagler and More. Nobody hardly knew anything about that. It's never been published before, much. Just a little mentioned sometimes in the Flagler books, but not as much detail as I was able to surface with my research. They were really quite complementary in many ways, and sometimes their personality was quite similar. I mean, Flagler was a rather taciturn person, a man was rather circumspect, a man that you held his cards close to his vest. People couldn't penetrate the shield that he had, you know. And there's something to more similar kind of personality. But More was a good businessman, a good financier, and I think my sense is that Flagler appreciated that. And so he was willing to give money to More, especially secretly, because he respected that More was going to use it properly. And I think Flagler respected that. But there's no correspondence between Flagler and More. Both men, as Flagler didn't want anybody to know that he was a benefactor. More respected that, and so there's no correspondence between them, but there was verbal agreements.